I can feel myself especially heated this morning, and it's because we're talking about this crisis, and it's a crisis that doesn't exist. Walk us through what goes down if the president declares this a national emergency, the fallout. Because we have to remember, he didn't get wall funding from Republicans. Right. They could have gotten a deal, and then it was the Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulters of the world antagonizing and shaming the president into this corner, not the majority of Americans.
As you point out, it was Republicans who were weighing in on how much money they did or didn't want the president to spend on a vanity project that had nothing to do with national security, building the wall. The Constitution gives the Congress the power of the purse. If they elect to give the president money for a project he wants, he can then spend it. But he is not constitutionally entitled to do an end run around the entire Congress to raise money, to shore up a campaign promise, and to foster a cult of personality. And what you have right now, I don't think this is messaging or a PR blitz from this White House. This is raw propaganda. They are disseminating misinformation. Mike Pence, Sarah Sanders, Kirstjen Nielsen are all involved with it because they are trying to create the notion that there's an emergency and something should be done immediately to prevent it. There is no emergency on the southern border.
There was an emergency when children were being separated from their mothers.
And they didn't do anything. They dragged their feet on that. Mm-hmm. The crisis is not on the southern border. The crisis is in the White House.
Okay, Anna, I do want to walk through, though, excuse me, this shift. When Pence and Kirstjen Nielsen are now framing this as a humanitarian crisis, it was a week ago that President Trump tweeted this: our southern border has long been an open wound where drugs, criminals, including human traffickers and illegals, would pour into our country. And I have to say something quickly. You do not see the majority of drugs pour into our country on foot. That is not true. And having a wall isn't the only option for border security. He's also gone so far as to demonize those people in the caravan full of criminals. Walk us through. Now we're changing that tune to a humanitarian crisis. Because if it's a humanitarian crisis, then wouldn't that be a foreign policy issue and we'd be focused on the real crisis that is existing in Central America instead of pulling funding from those countries?
I think what we're seeing here is a real shift because it is a political issue. This is a symbolic issue between Republicans and Democrats, and they are entrenched on both sides, and there's no movement. And the White House is trying to find a way out of it. But it's pretty hard because this is not just for the past 6 months or a year that the president has used the border or immigrants going in from Mexico into the U.S. as something that he talks about on the campaign trail. He's talked about it for almost the last decade. And so to kind of go tonight and say, no, this isn't about politics, this is about a humanitarian crisis, and to try to pull away from that, I think is going to be very difficult for him. I do also want to make the point, as much as this is an argument that he's trying to make to the nation tonight, they are very, very concerned right now in the White House about what is happening on Capitol Hill with Republicans. You have a lot of Republicans who are very nervous and are not with Trump about keeping this government shutdown going, and House Democrats are going to force their hand, and there is concern that there could be almost 24 Republicans in the House who vote to open up some of these different agencies when the House goes and passes the bills separately.
This is a wow. Jason, we did hear VP Pence talk about border personnel and judges, but even when that was floated over the weekend, the money for those type of things was on top of the $5 billion for the wall. Yes. So is there really any negotiating room here? And again, Pence talking to staffers, ain't nothing happening unless it's Trump, because Trump makes a job out of undermining his own team.
Exactly, and lying. And it's hard to negotiate with someone who you can't trust because he changes what he says from week to week. So there is no negotiation here for two basic reasons. One, you mentioned before, Stephanie, we just had the midterms. This was an argument Republicans made in the midterms. The American people, including members of Congress on the border Congress people, Orange County in the South, people who would supposedly be affected said, no, we want the Democratic message. We don't want this wall.
But they also deserted this message after the election. How could you call it an ongoing crisis if the election's over and you barely mention it again?
But you still leave our troops there. Our troops are still spending the holiday there. Our troops are still away from their families there. Then on top of that, the president has made this politically toxic. There's no reason for Nancy Pelosi. There's no reason for Chuck Schumer to work with him because the president has made it abundantly clear he will racialize this argument. He will lie about this argument. It is absolutely impractical on a bunch of different levels. And I keep saying this because I think it's key for people to even understand, even if Democrats were to make a deal, even if Republicans were to make a deal, the number of lawsuits that you will face at the border because so many people's land has to be attacked by eminent domain, this won't even get built for a decade.
I'm going to tell you why I love the fact that Tim O'Brien is here. As a Trump biographer, you actually know the man he is. And for everyone who watched The Apprentice, who says he's an international businessman, yes, I trust him with the economy and deals. You wrote this piece talking about Trump, the image of being this ultimate deal maker, and you wrote this. Striking lasting deals requires intimacy with the finer points of what every party wants out of a negotiation. Realistic goals, maturity, patience, flexibility, and enough leverage so the other side cannot simply stall or walk away from the table. Trump has not met any of those prerequisites in his repeated efforts to fulfill his campaign promise to build a wall. You also give a ton of examples. It seems like Trump himself is the one who stands in the way of deal making, and that is in large part one of the reasons he moved away from being a developer and became a branding guy.
That's right.
Because he couldn't strike deals.
You know, the reality in all of this, and it's not a matter of opinion, Donald Trump was an abysmal deal maker. He routinely shot himself in the foot. In New York real estate, he was regarded largely as a cartoon character. Major developers never saw him as a serious threat in the real estate business. He was a branding phenomenon and essentially a human billboard who licensed his name for underwear, cologne, steaks, and other people's buildings.
And was great at it.
And very good at it. And he made a significant amount of money at it. But he was not the largest real estate developer in New York, and he was not someone who had assembled decades of great deal making. In fact, he was routinely taken to the cleaners in negotiations by other business people who were more patient, more informed, and more shrewd than he was. And you're seeing this replayed with Pelosi and Schumer. They have everything to gain from simply sitting back and watching the president self-immolate, because very early on in December, he turned to Chuck Schumer and he said, I'm fine with the government shutdown. I'll take ownership of this. I won't blame you. And he says that because he's deeply unfamiliar with the fate of people in Washington who have said they're the authors of previous shutdowns, like Newt Gingrich.
Jason, I want you to comment, because dumping on Trump or mocking him as a businessman is not about being sassy.
Right.
The reason it's so important is this guy would do deal after deal in New York, and now in the last 2 years, we've spoken to his counterparts who are laughing, saying, day after we closed the deal, he called me on the phone and said, hey, I'm going to call the New York Post and say I made $150 million out of the deal. Is that okay with you? And they were laughing all the way to the bank. They're like, yeah, dude, I don't care what page 6 says. I just want to make sure the check clears. Right. But now he's not a private businessman. He's running the United States of America.
He's running the United States of America into the ground and embarrassing us. And what I also think is important,
more than embarrassing.
You know, when we talk about a humanitarian crisis, the fact that the president has shown that in his negotiations he'll use anybody, any crisis, any people who are suffering to make his point. We talked before, he separated families and children in order to make a point to his base. We talked about before, children can die at the border in order for him to make a point. People are suffering now. You have people who will miss their checks. You have people who won't be able to feed themselves and their families. We talk about D.C. I grew up in parts of the Midwest where the biggest employer is the federal government. You've got small towns where everybody's job is dependent on the secretary, the office person, the office of the interior. He is allowing other people to suffer for his ego. That is a terrible trait for anyone who's negotiating, especially when we're supposed to represent the entire United States of America.
Please, please listen. President Trump, reconsider. Ivanka, if you care about a crisis, look over in California. We may have a teacher strike this week that will impact 500,000 kids. You want kids to advance in this world? Give them a great education. That's a crisis.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.